Hey guys, this is Dave with Audio In Reviews. Today I'm going to be reviewing the Softears Studio 4, and this is being marketed as an IEM that was developed and designed for use in the studio for mixing or as an on-stage in-ear monitor. So it's basically created with sound engineers and musicians in mind. As you can see, I have everything that's included in the box out on the table. Comes with the IEMs, a very nice padded case, a cable extender, some ear tips, 2 IEM socks to protect your IEMs from scratching, and a cleaning cloth. As for price, specifications, and design, the Studio 4 comes in at $449 and has a 4 balanced armature driver configuration. The shell is quite small and light, fits my ears very comfortably. The cable is a 2-pin cable with a 3.5 termination. I do wish there was a balanced option, but otherwise the cable is good. The design is plain, but the build quality is very good overall. The whole presentation, the plain black IEMs, black cable, hard case with the foam lining, IEM socks, and even the cable extender is exactly what I would expect to see with a package that's designed for either studio or stage use. So this all makes sense to me. And I know, because I've destroyed my share of IEMs, and all of these little extra protective precautions are very necessary and appreciated as a musician, especially for a musician that might have to travel a lot. And also the cable extender is very thoughtful as well, because if the musician or vocalist doesn't have a belt pack to plug into, that means they have to plug directly into the personal monitoring station. And if you don't have an extender, you can't really move. You're kind of taking a risk of your cable either coming unplugged or just breaking your cable, which that's actually happened to me a couple of times. So having that extra couple of feet of cable means that's one less thing that can go wrong on the stage. So I like that they did include that extender. Okay, let's talk about the sound of the Studio 4. So, as I mentioned earlier, the Studio 4 is designed with sound engineers and musicians in mind. And according to Softears, these are tuned for use as actual monitors for either studio mixing or as on-stage in-ear monitors. And it just so happens that's actually how I got my start into this hobby. I was introduced to IEMs initially because I'm a drummer and I was using them on stage for live performance. And at the same time, I also just happened to be working for a pro AV company that started to sell in-ear monitor systems for stage use. And we're talking a while back, probably 10 years ago. But I still do use in-ears on stage right now on drums all the time. That being said, this review will mainly be from the perspective of just personal use. However, towards the end, I will talk about my on-stage experience with these as well, just in case some of you might be considering these for stage use. Now, the overall tuning of the Studio 4 is neutral, but it does have some slight upper mid-range presence, and I'll throw a graph up on the screen so you can see. This is Softears' graph, which I didn't want to use, but I couldn't find one anywhere else. It does seem to align pretty closely with what I'm hearing, so that's why I feel okay about using it. But as you can see, they have a good sub-bass and sub-bass presence when you look at the bass levels compared to the rest of the graph. And that's a really clean bass shelf, by the way, but I'll talk about that when we go over the bass. However, if you jump over to the other side of the graph, you can see that there's a moderate ear gain bump around 3K. And past that point, the treble starts to decrease until the bump at 9K. Then you don't really have a whole lot of upper treble presence after that. But just to break things down a little further, starting with the bass. So the overall bass levels fall, as far as levels, again, fall just under my preference. But there is definitely enough to balance out the upper mid. So while there's just a little less bass than I prefer, it's still adequate. And now these are BA drivers handling the bass. It's all BA driver IEM. So the BA drivers are handling all the frequencies. So because it's balanced armature bass, you're not going to have the same kind of dynamics that you would get from a dynamic driver. They are good, but it's not going to be that dynamic driver style sound. But let's go ahead and break things down a little further, and we'll start with the bass. So the overall bass levels fall just under my preference as far as, again, the amount of bass. It's not quite as much as I normally like to have. There is enough, though, to balance out the upper mids. So while there's just a little less bass than I prefer, it's still adequate. Now, and again, these are BA drivers handling all the frequencies, and of course, that means they're handling the bass as well. So dynamics are pretty good, but they're not like what you would experience with a good dynamic driver style bass. So slam and punch are good, but again, these are BA drivers, and it's tuned with more of a reference style bass in mind. So the tuning approach, I think, was more focused on monitoring, and my guess is their goal was more geared as far as the bass was focused on accuracy and precision. And I definitely felt that with these because the bass is very clean. And I mentioned the bass shelf earlier, and you can see it starts at around 150 hertz and gradually rises up till the point where you get at about 30 hertz. So because of where that bass shelf starts at 150 hertz, the transition and separation from the bass into the mids is really, really clean. So there's no bass bleed. And what that translates into is really good mid bass and lower mid detail and clarity. However, at the same time, because that bass shelf starts at a lower point, the mid bass and lower mids don't have as much presence as I would prefer. So instruments like toms, some higher bass notes, and some male vocals that I normally prefer to have a little weight and heft sound a little bit on the light side to me. But again, what you do get is speed and clarity. And now moving into the mids, instruments and vocals have really good presence. So they don't sound veiled or overshadowed by any other parts of the tuning. They also have really good detail and clarity and generally just sound natural. And that extra small amount of ear gain is actually just about right to my ears, so it doesn't really push anything as far as instruments or vocals too far forward or cause them to sound unnatural in any way, at least to my ear. It sounds just about right. Now, as far as the treble, as you move past the 3K point, you can see that there is a small bump at 5K and another around 9K, but then past 10K, it just drops off in the air region. So up until about the 10K point, the Studio 4 is tuned very well, but once you get into the upper treble, you do start to lose some of that air and some of that sparkle. Not that it doesn't have any at all, it does, but it's just not as much as I would prefer. And this also does affect just a little bit detail or perceived treble detail, again, just slightly. Which brings us to technicalities. Now, for its price, the Studio 4 has very, very good overall detail retrieval and is actually quite resolving. Again, except for that little treble area. In the upper treble, there is a little bit of that detail missing, but the overall in the mids, the bass, mid bass, there's really, really good detail retrieval. And it's actually generally a very resolving IEM. The soundstage is about average. It's not super wide, but I wouldn't consider it intimate either. As far as separation and imaging, it's very good. Instruments and vocals were focused. However, they didn't quite have that note weight that I like to hear, but it's still very, very good. And now I want to use the technicalities, as a segue into my next part of the review, which is using these on stage. Again, because these are marketed for use, for studio use and also for stage use. And of course, me being a musician and having a fairly proper on-stage in-ear monitor setup, I felt it only right to actually test them out with my rig on stage. And I only got to use them for a few hours, but I feel like I was able to get a pretty good, solid assessment of where these land in terms of overall performance for use as an on-stage in-ear monitor from a musician's perspective. And now the reason I want to use the technicalities aspect as the segue is because while proper tuning for your specific use is important, if you're a vocalist, you want it to be kind of tuned for vocal use or for guitar use. Usually drummers and bass players like a bassy IM. I'm a drummer. I don't necessarily like a bassy IM, but I do like a little bit of extra bass presence. So tuning is important. However, technicalities are also very important for me on stage. And while I know you don't necessarily have to have a super technically capable IEM to be able to have a decent on-stage experience, my experience has been that in combination with having a properly tuned IEM for your specific use, having that little bit of extra definition and separation can sometimes be the difference between a good on-stage experience or a frustrating one. Because not only do I need to hear myself clearly, I also rely on other, sometimes very subtle instrumental cues that might tell me what's coming up next. And if I have an IEM that I know I can rely on to deliver all of those cues and those fine little nuances, not only does it give me more assurance and confidence as a musician on stage while I'm playing, it also frees me up to enjoy the experience a little more and to maybe get creative and get that next level type of on-stage experience. And now, of course, the most important thing is having a proper mix to begin with, because if you don't, then it doesn't matter how good your in-ears are. So that's usually stage one for me, is getting a proper mix. But how did the Studio 4 perform on stage for me? Well, in terms of tuning, they're good. Again, for me, I prefer a little more bass, but they would no doubt be great for a vocalist or a guitarist and probably even a bass player. They do have enough bass presence. That being said, even though they weren't tuned exactly to my preference, they still gave me a very good overall stage experience because their technical capabilities. These have really good instrument separation and detail retrieval. So once my mix was dialed in, I had no problems hearing myself or hearing the other musicians and those fine little, those nuances that I use as cues that might tell me what parts of the songs are coming up. So on stage, these actually performed very, very well, especially for this price range. Now, of course, it's also very important for the IEM to be comfortable and provide good isolation, especially if you're a drummer or near drums on the stage. And while these are very comfortable, I did notice there was a little more sound bleed than I am used to with the other IEMs I use, but it was okay. And once I actually found the proper tips, it did help a little bit with that. So, and that was with, once I got the proper tips, a proper seal, there was still just a little more stage noise and drum sound that was bleeding through than I'm normally used to. It wasn't bad, just a little more than I'm used to. But at the end of the day, I was very pleased with the Studio 4, not just for personal listening, but also on stage. So just to kind of summarize my experience with the Studio 4, my only little nitpicks or complaints are the lack of upper treble presence, and I do wish they had a little more bass and mid-bass presence. That being said, I like everything else about these, and I know I did talk a lot about stage use, but most of my testing was done at home, just listening to music like I normally do when I test IEMs, and these are great for that too. And despite them not being tuned perfectly to my preference, they are tuned really, really well. So if you're looking for something that has a more neutral tuning and great technicalities, then this might be something for you to consider. Or if you're a musician and you might be looking to get that next upgrade for the stage, then I absolutely recommend the Studio 4 for home or stage use. It checks all the right boxes for me. So that concludes my review of the Softears Studio 4. Thanks so much for taking the time to watch. If you like my content, please take a second and hit that subscribe button. Also, if you would please like this video, share this video. I hope you guys have an awesome day.